Today, September 3rd, 2020, I, Maya Hill, the interviewer, will be interviewing Miss Carol Merrill, location Zoom. For the project that this oral history will be for is the Black Student Alumni Oral History Project. So welcome, Miss Carol. I'm so thankful and grateful for this opportunity to be, interviewing you and to hear your story. So just to jump right into some of the questions that I have for you, can you just tell me where you're from and when you were born?
Okay, my name is Carol Merrill. I was born in 1948 in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, and so I'm from Ardmore. I lived actually in Ardmore all of my life, except for when I was at Penn State, and I sort of grew up in it's a suburb of Philadelphia. It's on what's known as the Main Line. So where I grew up, it was a tight-knit Black community surrounded by a more white and affluent community. So the school that I went to was Lower Marion High School, had a wonderful reputation back then. And all through, besides elementary school, all through junior high, high school, we were basically in the minority. Usually I was maybe the only one, maybe only one of two Black students in the classroom.
So what was that experience like as a young child, knowing that you were in a, tight-knit Black community and where you lived, but then going to a school where you were the minority? Like, what was that experience like, and how did you kind of adjust, even in being a child or in high school?
Well, if I look back at elementary school, our elementary school was predominantly Black by the time I was there. And so the majority of the white students were in special ed classes that were down in the basement of the building.
Wow.
But when we went to junior high, that's when all the elementary schools sort of merged. And so one of the things that kept happening, teachers were saying, well, you got this in elementary school. And I'm like, no, I didn't. And it kept on going. So I shared it with my mother, other students shared with their parents. And then basically the NAACP got involved and said, the education for the students at Ardmore Avenue Elementary is not the same as for all the other predominantly white elementary schools. And so eventually they actually closed down my elementary school because of that.
Okay, so what did your parents do? What was your home life like?
My parents, my mother actually grew up in Ardmore. She was born in Ardmore. And so my family has a long history of being in this town, Ardmore. Actually, my great-grandmother came to Ardmore in the 1890s, early 90s, to find employment. And so then her mother, my great-great-grandmother, then followed after her husband died to take care of the children. So we were like one of the first Black families, in Ardmore. And I was fortunate enough to then at a later date when back in the late 70s, when Alex Haley was talking about all his research for roots, and that sort of sparked me to find out more history. I'd heard different things from my grandmother, so I actually interviewed my grandmother. And from that interview and talking to other people, I ended up putting together a booklet, the family booklet. I don't know if you can see it here, but it's it was the Strother family, Charlottesville to Ardmore. And so I detailed with some research, but mostly oral history, my family's background. And then I was able to sort of put this in the Pennsylvania Historical Society library, the library at University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And so it was a way of sort of capturing what I knew and then being able to leave that as a record for other people, my family, with the idea, like I published it in 1983. There was no Ancestry.com or anything of that, but now younger generations are asking for copies so that they can use this to as their foundation to go on and do deeper research. So that part is great. My father was just a laborer, a worker at the auto car. My mother was a homemaker. She did domestic work. And then finally, after my brother and I were born and out the way, she went back to school to study nursing. So, but in actuality, I was the first person in our family of all my cousins to go to a 4-year college. And I think when I talk about the community, I have to think about my church, because that was the place where, as Black students, no matter what was going on in school, when you were in Ardmore and in the church, that's where, as a child, you were cherished, you were groomed. This is where you learned how to speak publicly, doing your little pieces for Easter and Christmas and things like that, and with the youth group. So I think that gave me a sense of confidence that countered what I experienced sometimes in the school system, which didn't always value my intelligence. So it was, I had a youth minister who basically, Dr. Edward Sims, had us in 9th grade writing to colleges to get catalogs. And so we had a whole file cabinet with catalogs for colleges so that we could check and see where we might want to go. So my parents never said you're going to go to college. It was never stated, but from 2nd grade on, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And so if I wanted to be a teacher, there were certain things I had to do. So I had to make sure I got good grades in school. And luckily with Dr. Sims, I was able to follow the steps to get myself in college. Even though sometimes counselors would say, you don't need to take this course and you don't need to do this. I had him to sort of say, this is what you need to do. And so that basically set me on the right course.
So how did you hear about Penn State in specific? Was that one of the schools that you wanted to go to originally, or did you want to go to another university, that was in state or out of state? Even HBCU, was that of any interest at the time?
My reason for going to Penn State was not very lofty, educational or anything. Basically, a friend of mine who was a couple years older went to Penn State, and her niece was my best friend, and she invited us up our senior year for homecoming. So we went to homecoming, and it was like, oh, this is what college is like, your freedom, parties. There was a Kappa house, so we partied, and I was like, this is where I want to go. And that was it. And so that was my only choice. I got accepted. I was real excited. I got accepted, but then the rest of the letter said, you won't be going to the main campus. You'll be going to a Commonwealth campus. And so in my mind, ideas of me being the only Black person in some little hick town was not the idea that I wanted to deal with. So then I went back to our college catalog at church, went through to find some place that didn't have a admission fee. And I found someplace, Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I applied, they accepted me, and I was like, well, that's where I'm going to go. And so my plan was go there, not even real thinking that my parents would have to pay out-of-state fees and all. That never occurred to me. My plan was go to Eastern, have no social life, study hard, and transfer to Penn State. And I sort of kept that to some degree. One of the things I found out, though, was as freshmen, you had to pick your courses. And so I never made honor roll at Lower Marion. I was always like a B plus student. So in terms of my own understanding of my self-worth and my academic abilities, it wasn't all that great. So I did not, the time we had to choose courses and everything was very manual back then. You stood in line under a certain teacher or a certain subject course, and they passed them out and they were all gone. So they only had advanced English courses, and I was like, well, I can't take that. So I didn't take English my first semester there. And I met a lot of young people from the Detroit area who were National Honors Society, number 1, 2, 3 in their class. And I was like, wow. And as it turned out, I had to tutor them in their English classes. And that's when I realized that the quality of the education that I got at Lower Marion was far superior to what a lot of students were getting in inner city schools. So when I finally did take the English course, my second semester, I got an A in it. I, made the dean's list, and then I transferred to Penn State as a sophomore.
Wow, that that is amazing. And I was going to ask, like, how did the high school that you went to prepare you for, college? But it seems as if you had an amazing preparation, even before you were able to even notice it. It was not until after you had the opportunity to use what you knew to help someone else, to see the level of student, or even, I guess, the level of intellectual ability you had to even compete at the same level as them. So
when I got to Penn State academically was not a big thing for me. I knew how to study. I knew how to do research. I knew when I had to sit down and buckle down. And so that's what I did. So I had advantage for some people who really didn't grow up around a lot of Caucasians. That was my experience. So it wasn't shocking. It wasn't, intimidating for me. It just was what it was.
So what year was it when you transferred to Penn State? Because I know it was a quarterly semester.
Yeah, we had quarters, 10-week quarters. And so I came up in September of 1967.
Okay.
Now, I went there with the idea that I was going to pledge a sorority, the Deltas, because my girlfriend's aunt was a Delta. And when I was at Eastern, they wanted you to try and pledge when you're a freshman. And I was like, I'm not pledging because I'm going to Penn State. That everyone sort of knew, I would, at the end of the year, are you going to stay? No, going to Penn State. So when I got to Penn State, I cannot remember the name of the hall. It was in East Halls. That was the furthest part of the campus at the time. And so it was, I don't remember, there were 5 or 6 stories. It might've been more than that, but the dorm that I was in, there are like 500 girls and 2 of us were Black. So my roommate was white. She had never been around a Black person. She had never seen a all Black magazine because I had Ebony. So it was what, but I was also eager to pledge so I could get into the sorority suite. So we had, the Deltas had a suite, the AKs had a suite. And so there you could be around other Black women. So that was my plan. I pledged my first term and then moved down to the Delta suite, and I stayed there until I graduated.
So did your expectation shift from when you first applied to Penn State and you found out you got accepted into a Commonwealth campus to the time you got onto campus and being a student at the university? Did your expectation shift of what it was like, or what it was supposed to be like, or how you pictured, when you mentioned you going up your senior year of high school and, seeing that it was fun, it was a good time, but when you got there, did you still have that same expectation, or did it shift because you were now going into your sophomore year, so you were much more mature and,
I don't know qualify as much more.
I
But
use the term lightly. Yeah, yeah. Use the term lightly. Much, you knew more about, what it was like to be in college than.
Mm-hmm. But I don't really, I can't really say if my expectations changed really. It was just, I'm going there, I'm going to pledge, I'm going to study, I'm going to graduate and become a teacher, and that was it. So I just did the things that I sort of knew I was supposed to do. And in the process, then after going into the sorority suite, I guess that would have been winter of '68. Um, then it was a whole new world because I was living with other Black young ladies, sisters. And so we had lots of fun, but we also helped each other academically. The Kappas and the Qs had houses. So weekends we would party. And so it was fine. I really enjoyed it.
So how did joining a sorority change your social life on campus? Like how did you find your place with it? Although I know you mentioned like you felt, the sisterhood and, just feeling like you belonged in that space, but how did you make that your social life? Like how did, out of that the sorority and fraternity life, like how did that build your social life with, other things at the university, if that makes sense?
I know what you're saying, and I don't know if I have a real answer. I keep saying it just was. That was the home. The sorority was the home. The guys would come up at times. We were planning different things. It just was. That was it. There weren't any other. I wasn't sort of thinking of other options. That was our safety net. And so we sort of flourished within that culture, meeting other, students, guys, partying, working. And then certain things started happening, as, things that were going on down south, the sit-ins, all those things started to sort of play into the background, and the background then became a part of our reality. I mean, like I remember very vividly asking, when I was in high school, asking my mother, can I go down south and join in the sit-ins? And she was like, no, you can't. And I was mad. Because I'm seeing stuff on television and I wanted to be a part of it. And then in ninth grade, the summer before I went into ninth grade, was the March on Washington. And my father's union had a bus. And so he didn't want to go, but I wanted to go. So I went, my older cousin and I went, but because he was a union member and he wasn't with us, we were at the bus and they wouldn't let us go. So I had to watch the whole thing on television. Very disappointed about that. But so I had certain ideas about activism, but I didn't think of it as being really activism. I mean, like even second grade, I had a girlfriend who was white and went to her house to play. She invited me over and got to the porch, and her mother, looked at me and like, she can't come in, you can't have Negro friends. And so that was one of my first run-ins with overt racism. And then later on, maybe sixth grade, seventh grade, my father's union had their annual union picnic, and they were going to a place where they had a pool. So we were all excited, going to go, have good fun, have a bathing suit and all. And then we get there after lunch and they're like, you can't go in swimming. And it was like, we don't allow Blacks. So that was another, slap in the face in terms of reality. So there were little things that happened. I mean, like I can remember sitting in a history class in high school, and they would always, whenever it was Africa, they would always play videos of showing people whether the ladies were dancing topless, if they had pictures with saucers in their mouth, and all the other kids are laughing, and I'm like sort of cringing because I did not have any kind of foundation of African history. And so all I saw was what they were showing. And so that discomfort, I didn't really know what to do with it. And it wasn't until I was at Penn State, those 3 years, when I developed both the knowledge, the experiences to sort of see what those feelings were back then and why they weren't justified, how they became, and then to sort of overcome those kind of feelings.
So I have one more question about Greek life. You made reference to it being survival. That was your way to survive as a Black student on, Penn State's campus. Could you break that down a little bit more in terms of survival, knowing what survival is? But
okay, when I went to Penn State, there were 24,000 students, 300 Black students. So the numbers were off. So even though I was used to being around Caucasians all through my secondary education, there was still a divide somewhat. There was still prejudice, not that I can remember specific things, but just attitude. And so being in the sorority, you were surrounded by people that both looked like you, had similar experiences that you had, and that had made a commitment to be like a sister, a family. And so that's the kind of, I think, insular support that the sorority and I guess the fraternities sort of offered. A group of brothers, a group of sisters. We didn't, and because of the time that I was there, we weren't into the competition between AKAs and deltas and things like that. We tried to, the reality was if there's only 300 Black students here, we don't need to be dividing. We need, if we're going to do some things, we need to do it together. And so that was the sense. And so the comfort level where you could just be yourself in the sorority suite, where you could, party with all the fellas at the Kappa house or the Q house and later on the Alpha house and just have a good time, was like when you were in high school, when you're among your peers. So I think that's what the Greek life sort of gave for me. But then it was also then the genesis for a lot of the activism that came about. So Cynthia Cotton and Shelley Todd, they were AKAs, but they came up with this idea of having this production. We called it a montage. The name actually was A Day in the Life. And we had flyers. This is sort of a flyer of that. And that was the first time, besides when I was growing up in church, where I had to do something really dramatic. And when I think back on it, I think that the montage itself was, well, for me, and that was one of the first times that the Black students got together as a community to perform as Black students and to show and sort of showcase our culture through poetry, through music. And I think that it buoyed us up. It made us stronger, more cohesive. And there's a lot of learning going on because I didn't know a lot of the poems that we were reciting. I had never heard of Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn. So it was a education in some ways for me. In fact, there was a letter to the editor at the Daily Collegian, and the title was "A Day in the Life, Reverse Prejudice." And so this white guy wrote, that, we were focusing on African and African American history, where we, being prejudiced and not including white history and blah, blah, blah. So there were some responses to us acting as a unit, to us sort of displaying our culture. But I think that made us stronger and tighter, and then made it easier for us to sort of see that as a group, we had some power. As a group, we had concerns, and as a group, we could make some kind of changes, or at least have our voices heard. Okay.
Yeah. So when did you begin, or where did you find your footing when it came to student activism on campus? So I know around 1968, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for Penn State, just by basing my readings off of the Daily Collegian, it seems that's when it was a kind of like the beginning for Penn State student activism in full effect, where bigger protests were held, and like the Douglas Association, I think it was founded in 1967, which was a year prior to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So where and when did you find your footing in, student activism at the university?
And it's funny because you're talking about student activism, and I didn't think of it as student activism. I just thought of it as we're doing what we have to do. I don't know. I'm going to go back to that montage, Day in the Life, as for me, the key event that sort of solidified a lot of us as a group, not just fraternities, sororities, and independents, but as a group of Penn State Black students. I mean, I remember being in the suite and watching television when found out about Kent State. And that's when it dawned on me, if they're going to kill their own, they're not going to think twice about killing us. So this is serious. And just the sense of sadness, anger when Martin Luther King was assassinated. Those are vivid memories that I have in the suite learning about these things. What was your question again, ma'am? Am I answering?
No, you answered it. Yeah, you answered it. And montage actually occurred, just from in May 1968, which was a month prior to, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So even in that was, as you mentioned, kind of like the turning point where things kind of began to shift. But I did want to mention, since you became a Bell, you were nominated to be one of the first Bells. We are going to mention that in this interview. How did that also, being the first or one of the first African-American women Bells to be, documented in the yearbook, what was that experience like, and how were you nominated? I don't know if it was, was it based off a nomination, or, was it a selection process? Like, how was that?
All right. Well, that was like in it was either late 69 or early 70. Yeah. And so I wasn't aware at the time that I believe Barbara Toomer was the first Black young lady to be in the LaVie Bell. But my thing was, if you had an application form, and you had to send in a picture. I actually have a Xerox copy of my application. It's old. But I had a picture of myself in African fabric draped around. And what I did was like, all I saw was white girls in there. We need to have some Black representation. So I tried to get a lot of other senior girls to apply for LaVie Bell. And so one of the things that I wrote in my letter, besides list, I had to list all the different activities I was in. And I said, for too long, La Vie has been dirty white and choosing young women on only one standard of beauty. The white American standard for female beauty is neither the only one or the best one. Since America, Penn State included, is culturally pluralistic, it should reflect this pluralism. To be more specific, La Vie should recognize and represent the Black beauty on its own standards of this campus. And so for some reason, they decided they would choose me. I did have different activities. And so I will say, I think I was the first one to have my hair natural in La Vie Belle.
Yes, the starting of change, even in the wording of your, of your application points out change needs to occur. So if you could, what was one, or describe one of the most impactful kind of protest or demonstration events that you were a part of? And I know there was several, but if you could describe one that kind of really impacted you or your view on, the activities that you were doing at the time.
Okay. When I was looking at the questions, I could not really answer that per se, because I don't remember. Okay, we're talking 50 plus years. I don't remember all the things. I remember being in President Walker's office. I remember the sort of fear that he had. We're all in the office sort of surrounding him. I remember being in the Shields building and the chains that locked the doors from the inside. I was involved, but I was on the periphery for some things. I will say the thing that stuck out for me the most was when we had, and I don't remember the specifics, I don't know what the demonstration was, but two of our members of Black Student Union, Vincent Benson and Kenny Waters, were arrested. And I guess that was like the shock. No one had ever been arrested before. We had to think about how to raise money for the bail. That was the first time I ever went to a courtroom and they had their hearing. And before we went to the courtroom, what surfaced was a list of other people who would have to be the leaders. If something happened to our frontline leaders, we had to have a group of other people that would take their positions. And so my name was on that list. One of my sorority sisters, Charmaine Turner's name was on that list. And that's when it really hit home that this was serious. Vincent and Kenny paid a very high price for the activism. They were sort of kicked out the university. Their transcripts, unless they paid certain amount of money, they wouldn't get their transcripts. That was like, the point where it's like, this is real and there's serious consequences. Like, my parents never knew I was involved in anything. That's the way I wanted to keep it. So I was fortunate that nothing happened to us, but I do always respect Vincent and Kenny for making a serious sacrifice for students.
So what was the role of women in, I guess, I keep referring to it as student activism, but as you refer to it as, this is something that was, what we, kind of needed to do. What was the role of women? Were there women in, that became president or vice president of any of the organizations that you were a part of, or did women kind of like reflecting on like the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, all of these other movements, did the woman kind of just take the backseat of, you know, secretary, or, you know, just building up the organization as a whole, getting people to come to events and, you know, etc.
It was a combination, I think, you know, so you had the guys, the Black guys, you know, in leadership. And so in learning, reading about, you know, both the African culture, you know, and experiences in this country, we wanted to try to build up our men in various ways. But I think, you know, in most situations, you have women who become the backbone, the doers, the behind the scenes, getting things done. I came across, I mean, like we had lots of publications. So the Black students, so we did have a Black Student Union. I have like bulletins from the Black Student Union that we have, you know, printed up. We had like newspaper called the Black Eye. And have you ever seen that before?
No, I did see the pin. I was going to mention
the pen
that was for youth.
Yes,
Arts
I was
Fest.
trying to find my pen.
Okay. No, that same pen was used for Arts Fest.
Yes. And then we also had a newsletter called Scram. Had you seen any of that before?
No.
Oh, okay. So I've got 3 different scrams. We had one scram. I'm not sure. I got my dates because unfortunately we didn't date everything. One was titled, well, the front article was, top articles, How to Be a Well-Adjusted Negro. Then we had one, the title, first page was An Appeal to the Black. And, and I just realized I had an article in there. And then there was another one, Historic Landmark Sharpsville. So we tried to include a lot of information, sharing information amongst ourselves about our own culture and history. So that was, because I was an English major and I like to write, that was always a key element for me. That was my area of contribution. I do have to show you one thing, because you mentioned about women, the young ladies, and this is a little invitation. It has a guy's name on it, I don't remember him, but inside it has Night for Our Kings. Beautiful Black brother, we are inviting you to share an evening with us, November 21st, 1969 at 8 p.m., Wesley Foundation, 258 East College Avenue. Contact us to let us know if you can attend, and we have telephone numbers. And then we signed it IFE, which is Yoruba for Love, Black Women's Organization. So we did actually have like a separate group to sort of Black women. So this sort of proves that we both were organized and that we also tried to uplift our young men at the time. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that does. And it kind of hits on something else that you mentioned, the kind of idea of the contributions that everyone was making was singular and also communal. At the same time, it was benefiting, you know, you on an individual level, but it was also building up the African American community as a whole. So outside of, you know, your involvement with I guess African American organizations at the time, what other roles or what other activities were you a part of that, you know, did not always involve my majority of, you know, African Americans, but kind of made you the only one, whether it be, you know, I know you were the secretary of the Daily Collegian
No, it wasn't that. Okay.
No, not the secretary. Okay.
Not the secretary. No. I'll get to that in a minute. Let me just sort of say that I remember getting training to advise young men, primarily Black young men, how to avoid the draft and what things to do, because the draft was like looming over our head constantly. And so that, in terms of other areas, the Vietnam War was always a present force that we were aware of. So that was one of the things that I tried to do. Because I had already, you know, if I have children, yeah, I'm going to make sure they learn French so they can go to Canada.
Yeah.
I was, when Ted Thompson became the president of, was it USG, Student
The
University?
student government,
Yes. Because I knew him in high school. We were friends, so he wanted to open up things and get more Black people in. So it's like, I want you to be on the board of directors with the Daily Collegian and take, you know, so I ended up being the parliamentarian. Did I know anything about being a parliamentarian? No, but I did it. You know, I supported Ted in all of his activities, and because of growing up in a school district that was predominantly white, I figured I could negotiate. So I would go to the meetings and I did what I had to do. But a lot of my time was spent with writing things. So when we so the montage was in '68. Then we had the first, well, between what the Douglas Association and the Black Student Unions was doing to pressure the university to get money so we could have some celebration of our culture. My area then was to deal with some of the print aspects. So when we had money, we decided we would have a magazine for the first Black Arts Festival, which was, Montage wasn't called a Black Arts Festival, but it was. But the first Black Arts Festival, we had a magazine. We had money for a magazine. And so I was sort of in charge of that. I had no experience with publishing, printing, or anything. So basically that was my first introduction to going to a printer, finding out about paper type, color, all kinds of things, budgets, ads, things like this. And so this was a copy of our first magazine. And it was called Aquarius. And because at that time, the age of Aquarius. And so this was the magazine that we put together to go along with the Black Arts Festival. And it was called It's Our Thing. And so there are various articles in there. I mean, like the first Arts Festival, we got the most money. And so we really did it up. We had people from community around Pennsylvania and outside. So we had Bowie Hayden, who was the educator, come in. We had Walt Palmer from Philadelphia. We had Maddie Humphreys. We had Father Paul Washington from Philadelphia. So we had support of adults, established adults in different areas come to Penn State to support us and to basically educate us. And so we had Rufus Harley, at that time he might still be the only jazz bag pipist around. We had Robert Kenyatta, who's a well-known drummer in Philadelphia. We did a play called A Day of Absence. I don't know if you remember that play, where I can't remember the author, but it takes place in a southern town, and they wake up and all the Black people have gone away. And so we actually did it in whiteface. And we had James Brown, the James Brown Review came up. We had Adam Clayton Powell come and speak. Ruby Dee was there. So we you know, the Freedom Theater in Philadelphia was up there. So we just had a lot of resources. It was a real celebration, a real education. So we were immersed in all aspects of Black culture. And so it went from a Monday to a Sunday. And we just had all kinds of things going on. And we had the Original Slaves, which was a big group in the Philadelphia area during the late 60s, early 70s. Muddy Waters, Playthel Benjamin, who was a historian. So we had, I don't remember who got this lineup, and Rick Collins may have a better idea. I'm trying to think of the brother who was in charge of the Jazz Society, but we had a really comprehensive programming for that time. And then the magazine was just a means of highlighting, again, different writings. So Shelley Todd had an article in here. Cynthia Cotton, she was a chairperson of the Black Arts Festival Committee. So she had an article. So there were all kinds of articles. I'm actually going to give this to the university in some form for their archives. So, and we did a lot of advertising. The Daily Collegiate had articles like featuring Ruby Dee, and there was an article, Black Student Union starts a magazine concerning Black arts. So this was like a article being a little ad for Rufus Harley. And we had a big fashion show. And so this was, so the students, we wore different African dresses, garbs, the dashikis. This was a big, we like this. It was like a full, this was called the Pennsylvania Mirror. And so we had a whole full page showing different fashions and stuff that we were modeling for the program. So that was the Black Arts Festival #1. Then in 70, we had a second one. And this is the magazine that we produced. And this time our theme was motion. And if you see the artwork, it's like, I guess, sort of celestial in terms of, I'm not going to say black hole, but the universe revolving, Milky Way, whatever. And it was called Motion. And so, and of course it says, Black Arts, a political movement by Black people for Black people. So we were, we still tried to keep going in terms of publishing what we were doing, publishing information that we could all use to learn and deepen our understanding. One of my prized possessions from the second one is this book. And this is called Homecoming. It was the first book that the poet Sonia Sanchez ever wrote. And I was assigned to be her guide, to pick her up from the, I don't know, it was the airport or the bus station or whatever, and show her around the whole time. So the fact that I have the book and it's autographed to me has always been something very special.
Wow.
So those were, so my areas were more in publishing. I do want to maybe share one thing because of what we were doing. It carried over sometimes in our academics. So I remember having, because I was an English major, I had to take American poetry class. So get in the classroom, I get the syllabus and all, and this big textbook we had to have. And I went through the table of contents. There wasn't one Black poet in the whole book. So I was like, no, so I went, when I look back now, the nerve of me, but I was like, I'm not buying this big book and you don't have any Black poets. And the professor was very, I said, and by then we'd had Don Lee, we'd had Sonia Sanchez, we were reading all kinds of stuff. I knew there were Black poets that were born in America. So why are you teaching American poetry and not using any Black voices? And so he was open enough to say, I don't know anything about Black poets. If you want to teach me and teach the class, then I'll give you one of the class periods or two to do that. And so I started my research. I had mimeograph sheets of poems that I gave out, and I did a whole presentation from Phyllis Wheatley up to, at the time, Don L. Lee, now Hakeem Matabuti, and Sonia Sanchez. So the ironic and I don't know if they still have blue books for tests, finals.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, well, so my blue book, I still have my blue book December 5th of 69. And so the teacher sent me he included a letter, and it says, "Dear Miss Merrill, thanks so much. I ran off 50 copies of each page. The master sheet should produce clearly for at least 100 more pages. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Next time I teach a poetry course, I'm going to concentrate on contemporary work, and you have enlarged my range of material tremendously. Sincerely, Jack McManus." So I appreciated that he gave me a chance to do teaching before I actually did my student teaching. But it was like, you're not going to do this. You're not going to teach American poetry and leave Black folks out. And so at least I didn't have a big fight in order to do that. One of the questions had to do with bringing in, demands and bringing in more Black students. And we quickly found out that Harrisburg, I'm not sure it was a 10, Harrisburg something,
10.
were our first group coming in. And we realized soon after that bringing Black students up, just to bring them up in numbers, doesn't mean anything if you don't have supports for them. And so then we had to sort of push for a lot of different kinds of tutoring, all kinds of buddy kind of things to help the students to get both acclimated to the environment and to the academics. But I was glad that we did we didn't have a Black student studies program, but we did brought in a professor from Chicago area that we later sort of found out was almost planted to the, what was the name? We called him an agent provocateur. But so he was there, but he was there to sort of help us, but also like spy on us. But we I never had a Black or African teacher in all my history of education until I went to Penn State the last couple of years. And so we had a class on by a African professor, and I actually took one was Swahili, and then one was a literature class. I had never heard of Chinua Achebe. So we read Things Fall Apart. That was mind-blowing for me. And so part of the paper that you had to write at the end was basically impressions of and from African thoughts. And so I was able to sort of analyze what I mentioned before about how I felt in elementary school and high school and all the different things that we felt, and then learning more about Africa and its true history and the liberation struggle. Penn State sort of opened everything for me in terms of my eyes to a wider culture. And then that affected the rest of my life. In terms of activism, going to Washington, there was a group called the NABS, National Association of Black Students, in our last year. And it was a national group. And so we worked with NABS. After graduating, I worked with Merrill and Vincent in Washington, organizing with them. We did organizing in Philadelphia. So from Penn State in those years there, it spawned a lot of other things.
Yeah,
All right,
wow.
I'm doing a lot of talking here.
Yeah, no, but this is leading to our my final kind of question for you, based off of, your time at Penn State and the legacy that you left. If you could, so I'm going to put two questions together. Um, just due to the time, because we have about like 2 more minutes. But if you
Okay.
would summarize your college experience in a phrase, what would it be and why? And then as you look back over your involvement and all that you did at the university, what legacy can you say that you left there and that is now trickling on till today?
Okay. I don't sort of think about legacy. You know, I don't think telling the story and what we did, I
Hmm.
think is important.
Hmm.
If I would try to summarize, I thought about crystallization, the word crystallization, because crystallization of all my prior thoughts, feelings, experiences, and anger. And from my time at Penn State, I better understood what I grew up with and experienced ways to right the wrongs that I saw. So I think my 3 years at Penn State helped to crystallize everything that I had dealt with before, everything I learned at Penn State, and then it directed me toward the rest of my life.
Wow, boom, mic drops. Way to end an interview. But Miss Carol, I just want to say thank you for, your time, and thank you for sharing all your wealth of, information and in your experience, which above all is just kind of amazing just to hear, especially from some of the things that I had the opportunity to read and write about in my paper about, Black student life at at Penn State during a time where, there was racial tension. So I just want to say thank you for, just taking the opportunity and saying yes to this so that other people can hear your story and understand your experience better at Penn State and what it was like to be a student at the university when, at a heightening time in the country as well as on the university. So just want to say thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you've decided that our story was important enough to tell. You know, we're really, the five of us, I think, are really thankful that you have taken on this project. We might not have done it on our own, but I thank you.
Hold on one second.